Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, June 13th, 2023. Tonight's broadcast is about religion and psychotherapy, religion and therapy at Evoke Therapy Programs. I'm going to be talking about our approach and kind of how we view religion and it's how it fits into our idea of psychology, of healing, of child development, of parenting, and so forth, and what our role is in all of that process. So I want to start off with this story. Years ago, I was in a parent group, and after teaching the group, one of the parents walked up to me. I don't remember if it was at the break or it was at the end, but they said to me that some of the things that I was teaching come into conflict with some of the things that they're hearing at their place of worship, where they go to worship. And I remember being a little bit stymied by that question, by that dilemma. What's my answer to that? They asked me how to make sense out of that, and I really didn't have a good answer. I thought about it, and as is my practice, I went to my therapist, who was a master therapist, and asked her about that idea. And she said, "That's an easy answer." Of course, she said that. She said, "It's an easy answer because you're not their rabbi, you're not their priest or their pastor. You're a therapist. You're a child and parent educator. So you don't have to reconcile it. That is their job. Your job is to let psychology, the research, your practice be the thing that informs you." Now, I do believe my experience is that at the core of all the great religions in the world, that there are these truths that can be found with the things that we teach. It might not be with your specific congregation or your specific temple that you go to, or your mosque that you go to, but I definitely believe that if you look hard enough in your spiritual practice and tradition, you can find all the things that we're talking about, but they might not be so evident and apparent, especially one particular Saturday or Sunday where you might be hearing a message. So I'm going to talk about Evoke's Way. And again, when I say Evoke's Way, this is our foundation. All of our therapists have unique aspects and approaches to things, but this is the thing that underlies everything that we do. First and foremost, we at Evoke are neutral when it comes to religion. We are driven by evidence-based psychological practices. We understand what it means to be trauma informed. So, if you will, our practice, at least when we walk into the therapy office, or in our case, the wilderness, our process is informed by the psychology, by our practice, by the research, by the literature, by our supervision. And somebody's practice or not is something that we take a very neutral stance towards. Now, I want to be clear that it is my opinion that I think that ideally is true of all psychotherapists, of all therapists of any kind. I know that there are approaches that integrate Christianity or Judaism or other practices. I do know that. But I have found it to be most effective at coming at it from a psychological lens, especially with adolescents, especially, particularly with adolescents, because that's a time of creating and developing and clarifying one's identity. And if we just look like an extension of the parents and their ideology, that's going to give them something more to push against. My second point is, while we are based in Utah, we are not a Mormon program. And in fact, at first I just put "we are not a Mormon program." And one of my colleagues, I asked them to look at this and they said, "You might want to give that some context." It's obvious once you're on site. It's obvious once you're listening to these broadcasts. It's obvious once you're listening to our therapists that influence is not a part of our practice. But it might not be that way for people that are outside of the state or they're considering the program. We support the child and the family and their views. It is an ethical guideline in virtually every therapeutic licensure and practice to not become involved or give direct advice on a client's big life decisions, major life decisions, and that would, of course, include religion. To the level of participation, the level of identification with the religion. We don't see that within our purview. It doesn't become an issue one way or the other for us. We're looking about general and foundational health. We believe that wisdom and healing can be understood within the religion practiced by the family of origin. I've always thought that it's interesting and maybe even important for anybody to go back and look at the religion where they were raised, their context. I mean, I believe that about everything. I talk about that with regards to all the contexts that I teach about and talk about in this process. But that there can be wisdom and understanding and insight. And again, I want to distinguish between one parent's or two parents interpretation of a religion and what is at the core of that practice, of that ideology, that dogma. We think that when therapy seeks a religious agenda, it is just as likely to drive the child away from religion as it is to draw them towards it. So while we might take a neutral stance, we believe the most effective way at supporting the child, and in fact, probably even leading them back to what they feel comfortable with in the way that they were raised, that the most important energy or approach is to take a neutral stance. That again, if we just simply take up the task or the baton from the parents, and I'm not saying that parents would do that, but sometimes we that's asked or implied, that if we take up that task, that baton from the parents, and try to execute that with the child, that it does more damage than it does good, and it's less likely that the child is going to find their way back to their context. Like I said, we are therapists and a therapy program. We are not religious leaders. That's essentially the advice and supervision that my therapist gave me. You don't have to figure it out. You don't have to make sense out of it. And in some ways, this really does go at the heart of the work. And while what I'm about to say might sound very nebulous and abstract, it's a real practice, and that is my belief, my teaching, that we don't know the client's truth. We don't know your truth. In my own family, I don't know my children's truth. My job isn't to figure out their truth and to tell it to them. My job is to support the child or the client or the parent, in this case, to find the truth for them. So if you decide, for example, that part of the home contract is going to be attendance at worship services once a week, it's not my job to tell you to do that or not. Now, if you ask me for an exploration of that decision, we can talk about that. Just like with every decision, it's not different with any decision about when to come home, how much screen time to have, what should you do when there is a violation of something in the behavioral contract, drug usage, positive tests. It's the same thinking, right? For years, I felt an obligation, a duty of mine as a young therapist, not really understanding what I've come to understand what therapy is, that I felt this obligation, this duty to be able to tell people what to do in their lives. And that's a tremendous burden to know, to be responsible for telling people what they should and shouldn't do in their lives, instead of saying, adopting an I don't know, I'm not sure. But because the fundamental task, and this is going to be a theme for tonight, because we believe that the fundamental task in psychotherapy is to help an individual become their most authentic self, and that the symptoms that they're displaying and the patterns of those symptoms, which can be categorized as a diagnosis, that those symptoms and those diagnoses are merely expressions of unresolved, unspoken needs and feelings. That if somebody can learn to embrace, to become who they really are, that they won't need those symptoms anymore. And because of our experience, we're not afraid that that idea of becoming your most authentic self is going to lead to chaos and hedonism and selfishness. We don't believe that. We don't see that. We don't think of it that way, and it's not our experience, of course. We believe that each participant in our program should be allowed to practice their religion while in our care. We enforce practices and cultures that support emotional safety. This includes the freedom and emotional safety to express and practice each individual's religion. So that is a core belief and practice of our program, that we do our best to encourage everybody's right to opt in or opt out. If sometimes there might be a group around religious holidays or practices where somebody's sharing or even teaching about their practice, their family traditions as it relates to their religious practices. And we give allowance for students to opt out of that group if they don't feel comfortable. Now they often do, especially because those lessons often comes with special treats or foods or menus. And children don't usually present the information in a way that feels threatening to the other children. But the idea is there that they're able, willing, and supported to opt out of those kinds of discussions if they want to. Special diets and accommodations will be made within reason for the practice of religious-based activities. If somebody wants to eat kosher or has certain values on the Sabbath, we will make allowances for those practices as much as possible. Sometimes, for example, if a client were to opt out of participating in chores on a Saturday for the Sabbath, if they're Jewish, then we would ask them to take on double the chores on Friday morning or on Sunday because somebody else is taking up their chore for them, for example. But wherever we can, we make those practices something they can easily participate in to the best of our ability, of course. We support the idea of a higher power that's talked about and taught in circles of recovery and addiction. This idea that a belief in something greater than yourself, it creates in an individual a sense of humility and an ability to surrender. It speaks to the idea of trust. I thought about it today a lot in writing these slides. That in attachment theory, it creates a similar idea to that idea that you're safe, you're home. That regardless of circumstances and situations which might cause pain and hurt and sadness and grief and loss, those are real, unavoidable as human beings. But again, underneath that, supporting that all is this sense that you're going to be okay, that things will be okay. We will not take up, like I said, we will not take up the agenda to have the child conform to the parents' beliefs. It just doesn't work, and it goes against our ethics and values as therapists at Evoke. We don't supply participants with religious literature unless it's requested by the client and approved of by the parent. Parents are welcome to send out their own religious literature if they want to, and we can offer that to the child. Sometimes the child rejects that. Sometimes the child is very happy to have that. But we take a very neutral stance with that, and we definitely discourage any staff member, any therapist from introducing the idea of any kind of religion or religious literature to a child. Even so far as to say that the serenity prayer that's often offered, usually offered at the end of 12-step meetings, which can be offered at Evoke at times to close a group. We'll change the phrase from serenity prayer to serenity meditation. Just to emphasize, it's a way of meditating on a mantra instead of a prayer. Participants, like I mentioned earlier, may opt out of participating in groups, traditions, ceremonies that derive from someone's religious practices. For example, meals, groups, gifts, lessons. Evoke therapists are neutral when it comes to religion and adhere to ethical codes which state that a therapist ought not to enter an opinion about major life decisions. For example, religious practices such as baptism or the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. We don't get involved in telling them how they should navigate the road that they should travel in their life. Which again, ironically, like so many things in this parent education that I talk about, gets us to a point where the child often, through invitation, through modeling, may tend to come back or to gravitate toward the practice involved with their family of origin. We will not use religious ideas in the practice of therapy unless it is requested by the child and approved of by the parent. So if I'm doing therapy, if our therapists or our staff are running groups, we're not going to use religious texts, religious ideas to make a point in the process. We might say something like, in Christianity, in Judaism, in Buddhism, in Taoism, this is what is taught. But we won't use it as a primary source of authority to make our point, to be right. The practice at Evoke, we believe, is a spiritual practice. And we believe part of a spiritual practice is understanding and integrating mind, body, and soul into it. We believe that Evoke facilitates and encourages mindfulness, which leads to gratitude, often core to people's religious practices. We also believe that religion can give people meaning to their suffering. While we can't remove suffering, to suffer is inevitable to some degree. To suffer is to be human. To suffer is to love and to lose. And while we can't take that away, we can help people, or religion, I should say, can help people find meaning in their suffering. The bigger picture, the bigger context. Nietzsche said it in a very secular way, but it speaks to the same idea. He said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." The book Man's Search for Meaning, written by Viktor Frankl, read by many of our clients, is also takes that idea that if you have a why, you can bear extraordinary pain and suffering. I think about family and tradition. You know, we like to approximate family traditions, to have religious practices around the December holidays that look and sound like people's home experience to a limited degree, of course. And really, what when children are here for holidays, for religious traditions, for graduations, for the birth of a sibling's child, graduation, even funeral in some cases of more distant family members. What we think is we're really trying to get to a place where the child can be home and with the family for the many holidays to come. Yes, as I always say, they might miss the 4th of July. I'll just say because that's the next big holiday coming up. They might miss the 4th of July in 2023. But this is an investment in the 4th of July in 2024, 25, 26, and so on. We do use the idea of metaphor, of symbols, of story, of parables and allegories. One of the primary reading assignments for most all of our students is the Knight in Rusty Armor, which is an allegory that again teaches, like many of the world's religions teach, this idea about becoming your highest self, finding the divine within you, getting close to God is what religious folks might say, which is finding your most powerful, authentic, empowered, liberated self, loving self. We practice ritual and ceremony. That's a really big part of our program. Rituals, transitioning from one stage to another, getting welcome to the group. There are certain rituals that they practice out there that are, again, not tied to one specific religious practice that cement the lessons and ideas. A big part of family therapy education, my degrees are in marriage and family therapy, talks about and teaches about how therapists help families create new traditions, new rituals. Something as simple as the dinner table. Something in our family as simple as I take my children to school every morning when I'm home. And we in connection with that, we take a selfie. We've taken a selfie for the last 10 years, my children and I, on the first and the last day of school. So I have a list of 20 or so photos of that first and last day of school. So it could be something as simple as that. It gives us meaning. It gives us something to connect back to. I wrote on here faith, radical acceptance, and trust. In Western religions, it's often talked about as faith in a higher power, a God, and that this higher power has an idea about the way that things are going to work out, that they have a plan, and that you fit into this plan in a certain way. This idea is supposed to give their followers a sense of confidence and trust in the world, especially through the dark or the difficult times. In Eastern religions, it looks more like the idea of radical acceptance. Specifically, that's from the Buddhists, but the other Eastern religions talk about the same idea, that what is happening is meant to happen, that it makes sense, that it gives our life meaning, that it helps us to grow, to learn. And that the great, I almost pulled out a quote, that the greatest suffering, one Eastern religious leader said, that the greatest suffering is created because people are fighting against what is, or what was, or what will be. So that idea of trust, that idea of letting go, that idea of surrender, something I've been practicing a lot in my life actually over the last 6 months. Not the first and only time, but definitely something that I'm very conscious of. My family members have even noted it. Some big life decisions, we're moving, some other things going on, and I get really attached to the idea about how things should look and get very intense about it, very controlling around it. Some of you might relate, of course. And I've been practicing this idea that I don't know. I'll do my best, but in the end, it's a letting go process. Telling the truth. Another phrase that could be putting here is letting go. Telling the truth is one of my favorite simple examples of what it looks like when somebody surrenders and lets go. If I tell the truth to you, to my wife, and I'm not talking about anything that comes to my mind anytime, but important truths, feelings, needs, requests, preferences, that the minute that I allow that truth to escape my mouth and land on the ears of the other person, I'm essentially letting go. To lie is to try to control. To exaggerate is to try to control. To withhold information is to try to control. Right? Those are the two kind of primary energies in that all of these religious traditions talk about. Trust and faith and acceptance, or in some religions, it's called being willful. And so we believe in those principles while we might talk about them separate from the idea of a specific religious tradition. We believe that those are important core concepts of becoming a healthy self, becoming a mature adult. Transcendence is really something that we talk about quite often, this idea of overcoming, transcending the facticity. That's what the existentialists call the facts of our lives. The essence of religious practices is, like I said, to give suffering its meaning, its context, and or to transcend facticity. Of course, you're going to experience grief and loss. If you live long enough and you love, very, very painful things will happen to you. And I don't need to teach this or preach this to parents, of course. But some kind of connection with a higher power, with something larger than ourselves, whether it's the universe or a specific God or religious practice. Give us a sense of grounding and anchor us. Give us a sense that everything will be okay. And again, while I might be myself, a very non-practicing spiritual person, non-practicing in terms of formal organized religion, it's still a practice that I developed, this practice of letting go, of surrendering, of trusting, of knowing that I'll be okay instead of trying to control everything, to guide everything. So principles that we talk about that are consistent with virtually all the great religions are this idea of surrender and humility. If you look at the 12 steps, a third of them would talk about surrender and humility. And remember, humility is consistent with confidence. Humility is strength. It's teachability. It's the absence of insecurity. So of course that's going to be a core component of any therapeutic intervention. There is also, of course, a need for some will, right? I think people misunderstood, for example, the 12 steps when there's so much talk about letting go and surrender, but there's will involved in the 12 steps too. It's important to go to meetings, to get a sponsor, to make the decision not to pick up that drug or that drink, to not put yourself in situations that can be threatening or compromising to your sobriety. So anytime we ever hear a critique or even a philosophy that talks about one way or the other, we would be wise to be suspicious of that ideology, because it's both. Mental health involves surrender and will. It involves letting go and doing something active, some kind of action. And like I said, faith, radical acceptance, trust. In psychology, we know that trust comes from an internalized sense in the child that comes primarily from the parents and their nervous system that tells the child they're okay. And that lived experience of being okay. You know what I'm talking about. Because all of us have it to a greater or lesser extent at certain points in the day in our lives. That lived sense in our bodies that we are okay allows us to apologize, to own up to our mistakes, to make amends, to correct the path that we're on if we're off track out of our own integrity. So it's the faith and the radical acceptance look a lot like a secure attachment. A lot like it. Joseph Campbell said every religion is true one way or another in the Power of Myth broadcasts and book that he did with Bill Moyer in the 1980s, I believe. And in this sense, again, we could talk about universal truths and how they square up with all of the world religions that we know about. The Serenity Prayer. I was thinking about this last night, completely unrelated to tonight's broadcast. But as I was falling asleep, one of the things I was thinking about was how long ago I was introduced to the Serenity Prayer. And it goes like this for you, those of you that are listening who might not know it. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I was introduced to that 40 years ago. And today, it is still as relevant as anything I think about or practice. And in so many ways, the lack of internalization of this simple 3-part prayer or meditation mantra, the lack of internalization of these ideas can be found in so much mental illness and addiction. Learning to accept what is outside of our control. I hear funny and cute statements sometimes through social media where people are saying, I'm learning to not accept the things I can't change. That's just nonsense, right? They don't mean the things that you could change if you tried hard enough. They're talking about understanding the difference between working on yourself and working on changing everybody else. Now, of course, people that are healthy and active in their lives spend their lives trying to change and affect the world in various ways. Some politically on a large scale, some on local scale, some from just one relationship to another, some at work, a host of various ways. But in essence, this prayer has so much wisdom and is something that we all are would be wise again to think about and to practice as a mantra. And in essence, addiction, compulsive behaviors that cause harm in our lives, like drugs, alcohol, gambling, and the like, are attempts to chemically change what we're uncomfortable with, to not be present in our lives, to escape from our own lives, from being alive and living the life that's in front of us, instead of through support of a group or of a adequate therapist, understanding that we can go through the grief, through the pain, through the sadness, even through the depression, the anxiety, what have you. A lot of our approach can be categorized under the larger umbrella of existentialists. Good faith, according to existentialists, is taking responsibility for your life and your choices, regardless of circumstances. Bad faith is blaming your decisions on the things that happen to you. And that idea is not inconsistent with empathizing with somebody who experiences lots of pain. So when a child comes to me and says, my mom and dad are idiots, my mom and dad are the worst, my dad abuses me, my mom abuses me. emotionally. I will listen, I will empathize, I will understand. And implied in all of that, without saying it, because saying it sounds dismissive. But in my listening, in my silence, in my empathy, is the implication that asks the client, and now what are you going to do about it? Transcendence, like I said, is being able to see above and through the facticity or the facts, the situations of your lives. And then being honest with yourself, having integrity intellectually, psychologically. I used to give these phrases as a test to see if people could see the difference between good faith and bad faith. I drink because of my job. I'm unhappy because of my children's issues. My children make me happy. I became a lawyer because my mom was a lawyer. All of those are examples of bad faith. Blaming your choices specifically on positive, neutral, or negative circumstances. Versus saying it like this. I grew up in an abusive home and I chose, unconsciously even, to deal with that trauma by escaping through alcohol and drugs. My children are struggling with mental health and addiction issues, and I'm allowing that to consume my life. I'm finding it very difficult to find and hold on to peace and serenity. I love it when my children are happy, but I know that my serenity is my responsibility. My mother was a great influence in my life. Her career as a lawyer was inspiring to me, so I chose to get into the law. Subtle but important. More important than the words that I'm using to contrast the bad faith versus the good faith. And by the way, it's not about good or bad actions. It's just about the responsibility. The important distinction is the way of thinking about the world. And I'm going to take this off of the child right now. This goes for you, mom and dad. This goes for you, parents. If your children hold the key to your happiness and serenity, you're living in bad faith. You're modeling, you're teaching them that other people are responsible for their feelings because other people are responsible for yours. Now, I know it's difficult. I've said this countless times on these broadcasts that I have 4 children. And when they suffer and struggle, it affects me absolutely. But fundamentally, my serenity, my happiness, my meaning is my responsibility. That's what Jung meant when he said the unlived life of a parent is the greatest burden for a child to bear. So we take on the responsibility of our own lives. We model that for our children. We don't blame them for our misery, for our unhappiness. We go to other sources of support, other sources to mirror back to us, to give us a sense of ourselves, not our children. We don't place that burden on their shoulders. It doesn't work out very well for them. I want to say one thing about the parenting work that I do, and I talked about this last time. For those of you that are listening, the people that are watching most likely have had children in our program. They come and watch this live because they are current or alumni parents. So it won't necessarily be for you. But the people that are listening out there, I want to be clear that when I'm talking about parenting, it doesn't matter if you have children or not. That's not the point. I'm teaching about the human experience, what human beings, how they develop. And so when I'm talking about parenting, if you don't have children, even if you do have children, I'm talking about your childhood. I'm implying in what I teach and what I say some kind of insight or glimpse into how you've been wounded, the trauma that you still carry around. That is sometimes being leaked onto your children. That if we are awake and doing our job, gets better and better each generation, but doesn't totally get eradicated, the trauma. Because we're human. So if you're listening to this and you're wondering, well, I don't have kids, you're missing the point. That's one context where these principles can be understood to make sense and can be helpful and very practical, of course. But even if you are a parent, I want you to hear the things that I teach, the ideals that I talk about, the principles that I espouse to give you something to measure your childhood against. If it doesn't sound familiar to you, if what I'm saying sounds odd, or even if you can't even understand what I'm saying sometimes, that gives you an idea about what was missing in your childhood. Keep listening, keep going. After a while, you'll see it and then you'll realize it's everywhere. You'll see it everywhere. I borrowed this from Viktor Frankl. Man is responsible and must actualize the potential meaning of his life. He sees freedom and responsibility as two sides of the same coin. When he spoke to American audiences, Frankl was fond of saying, I recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplemented by a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. Finally, Frankl's most enduring insight, one that I've called on often in my own life and in countless counseling situations, forces beyond your control can take away everything you possess except for one thing, your freedom to choose how you respond to the situation. You cannot control what happens to you in your life, but you can always control how you respond. And that is the fundamental idea that we teach our clients. And then we don't burst in the front door announcing that. We start with empathy. We start with listening. We start with validating the feelings, the fears, the sadness, the grief. And that containing, that listening, that resonance, that support, that nurturing lowers the wall. It lowers the wall, the defense down, loosens them up, and makes the lesson of responsibility, of personal responsibility in their life relevant and more accessible. And the best thing that you can do, mom and dad, the best thing that you can do, parents, is to model that by not making the child responsible for your serenity. That is the number one thing you can do, is to demonstrate your accountability. Learn to apologize to your children in real time. Learn to own your mistakes. Learn to take care of yourself and not make the child responsible for taking care of you, your life, your meaning, your purpose. Yes, my children, I wrote in one poem one time that I'll wear out my body and the love that I feel for my children. That is true for me. And at the end of the day, my life is my responsibility. The same thing that you want to teach your children. And if you're like me and like most human beings on earth, that wasn't your experience as a child. Your experience as a child was you were made to think that you could make your parents proud, that you could make them happy, that you could make them sad, make them scared. And because that soup that you were cooked in was so comprehensive and present in your childhood, it became hardwired into your brain. And so this work at Evoke, this therapy, is to take you out of that, to transcend that, construct, to empower you, to liberate you. So the take-home messages for this evening: the goal of therapy is to become oneself, and by so doing, symptoms are not needed to express unexpressed feelings or needs. We are not a religious program and won't try to get the child to believe or adhere to a specific ideology. We don't think that that's ethical. And there will be programs that will promise you that. And that is not us. We will not discourage participants from living or practicing an ideology, and work hard to support a culture in our groups that is safe and supportive of each individual's belief system. And finally, we are the therapists. We are therapists and practice evidence-based practices, specifically attachment-based therapy, and don't practice religion in the context of the work that we do. I haven't had this opportunity in a long time. If there are any questions that have come in, I'm happy to answer those as it relates to this topic. And I can also go to upcoming events. If there are any questions that come in, you can send them in while I'm going over upcoming announcements. My two books, of course, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. If you'd like to do a deep dive into your own work, finding you, is something I cannot recommend too much. June 21st through 25th, coming up pretty soon, is the next available course. There's one spot remaining. We also have an online option that's half the price, excuse me, a third of the price and half the time. So if financial resources are strained for you or time is limited, the online option is a wonderful option. We created it during the pandemic and have kept it going because we've seen it to be so effective. We also have a returning to you that's available. I'll announce the date. We're working some things out with some folks, so we'll announce the date. But I'll be running the returning to you in the fall later this year, and then I'm going to be in the UK next week and be doing a Finding You intensive. We have custom Finding Connection intensives for couples and parents, and also Finding Family for families. And then intensives at evoketherapy.com if you have more questions about these things. We have support groups for current and alumni families. The next wilderness support group for current and alumni parents is June 15th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an alumni only meeting. June 27th at 6:30 p.m. is the next offering. And then for our intensives alumni, the next offering is July 11th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Contact Sarah D, SARAD, at evoketherapy.com for more information, or visit evoketherapy.com/family involvement. We have family treks that can be taken in the middle and at the end of our wilderness program. So if you're a parent of a wilderness child, you can come for several days and we can create a customized family trek for you and your family. Contact admissions at evoketherapy.com for more information. If you would like a coach for parenting, couples, co-parenting, transitioning home, helping you while your child is still in treatment, we have many, many coaches to offer you, many coaches on our staff who have been training the attachment-based model. They can help you with boundaries, transitions, even your own life, even individual coaching, if it has nothing to do with wilderness therapy or a child that's struggling with mental health or addiction. Contact coaching at evoketherapy.com. We ask all current parents to try out at least 6 12-step support groups, any combination of Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. Also, RefugeRecovery.org and NAMI.org have free classes and resources in your local communities. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast there, or go to soundcloud.com on your computer and you can listen and search for us there. You can also watch these broadcasts on Evoke's YouTube channel. You can watch the video and see the slides there. If you want to follow Evoke Therapy Programs or me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram, you can use the handles at Evoke Therapy or at Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. And the Evoke Intensives on Instagram can be, you can find them by searching using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching either Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, the Evoke Therapy blog on our website has wonderful content each week. What I love about our blog and the folks that write it from our team is they write about their own growth. They're not just teaching you about what you need to do or what your children need to do. They're talking about how this work has changed them, which is, again, at the core of the values at Evoke, that we can only help people insofar as we've done our own work. If you want to give back for people who can't afford treatment, the 3 charitable partners that we collaborate with and donate to are ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, and EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. You can earmark your donations for a specific population or even a specific program. My next broadcast will be June 15th. That'll be about 48 hours from now, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. It'll be a live Q&A. Any questions that you have, you can always email questions, suggestions, requests to webinar@evoketherapy.com. Those questions will go at the top of the queue. You can invite your family and friends to those broadcasts also. Looks like one question has come up. One person writes, do you have any advice on how to think about one's higher power when one doesn't endorse a specific religious construct of God? That's a really, really good question. I would encourage somebody that doesn't necessarily have a religious idea of the construct of a God to move toward the Eastern religions, where the idea of God is more metaphorical. The idea of God is an idea that is about the universe, all of us. There's a great app that teaches about this that I absolutely love. It's the only app that I've ever paid for, I think, besides apps for my children. It's Alan Watts. He's a teacher of Eastern religions, specifically Buddhism. It has 40 hours or so of lectures of his. And Buddhism is and Taoism and Hinduism are all religions that don't necessarily, like the Western religions, have this monotheistic, very strict idea about God. It becomes much more philosophical and spiritual. God is all of it, all of us. Alan Watts says in that broadcast, this is what really inspired me to think on a new level. He says in that app that I just shared with you, he said if Jesus had been born in India and said, I am God, or I'm the Son of God, they would have said to him, congratulations, you figured it out. And in Joseph Campbell, also Joseph Campbell is a great way to go also. The Power of Myth, the series with Bill Moyer, or the book, any of Joseph Campbell's works can approach religion from a, I want to say, secular perspective, but it's still very spiritual. Joseph Campbell's not non-spiritual. He's just not tied to one specific religion. Hence his quote earlier on in the broadcast that says, all religions are true in one way or another. And from Joseph Campbell's perspective, the idea of God is this ideal that we can identify with, that we can incorporate into us. It's really about secure attachment. And heaven is on earth right now, as or when we live this way. So Alan Watts, Joseph Campbell would be two sources I would encourage you to go to for that. So thank you for that question. Love it. All right, folks. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. I hope that gives you some perspective on how we do it, and also maybe even just helps you think about things in a new way, about spirituality, about religion, about therapy in a new way. I hope it does that for you. And as always, for and on behalf of the people that love you and the people that you love, thank you for showing up to these and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you in about 48 hours. Take care. Bye-bye.